All right, let's dive right into this explainer. If you've ever looked at a modern map of Asia and wondered exactly how those borders got drawn, well, the answer really lies in the 19th century. We're looking at a completely pivotal era here, a time when the entire global balance of power was being fundamentally rewritten. We're talking about a hard pivot away from traditional diplomacy and straight into the massive, industrialized machinery of empire.
Now, this industrial advantage wasn't just about having deeper pockets. It was about overwhelming, undeniable military hardware. Think about it. You've got steam-powered gunboats that can literally navigate up inland rivers against the wind and the current. You've got breech-loading rifles, meaning soldiers can fire rapidly and reload without even having to stand up. Throw in some advanced artillery, and traditional diplomatic resistance? It was practically impossible. This massive technological asymmetry is exactly what allowed European powers to just completely overpower much larger Asian states.
So, here is our roadmap. We'll cover the industrial advantage, the emergence of the British Raj, the economics of empire, French rule in Indochina, and finally, direct versus indirect rule.
Section 1. The Industrial Advantage. How technology redefined power.
So, the big takeaway right off the bat is that the common thread across the entire Asian imperial landscape was this undeniable military gap. I mean, whether we're talking about British forces moving through India, French conquests over in Indochina, Russian expansion pushing across Central Asia, or even China being forced into those humiliating, unequal treaties that stripped them of their sovereignty over their own ports. Traditional defenses just could not compete with steam and steel. Actually, diplomacy really requires leverage, right? And industrialization just systematically stripped that leverage away from Asian nations. Section 2, the British Raj emerges. From company to crown. Just to get our terms straight here, the Raj refers to the specific era when the British monarch directly governed the subcontinent. And it's kind of wild to think about, but this didn't start as a massive government project. It actually began as a corporate monopoly with the East India Company. But after the massive Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British government woke up and realized, okay, a private company simply cannot control this territory anymore. So they abolished the company entirely, transferred authority directly to the crown, and set up a viceroy to govern a staggering 300 million people through a bureaucracy mostly run by the British. If you track this timeline, you see an astonishing shift. You go from a simple commercial enterprise chartered way back in 1600 just to trade spices and textiles straight into a formal, massive empire. Look at that rapid compression of events right in the mid-19th century. The 1857 rebellion is the absolute catalyst. It instantly triggers the 1858 Government of India Act, establishing crown rule, and then boom, it culminates in 1877 with Queen Victoria symbolically being crowned Empress of India. But to really solidify this transition in the minds of the people, the British didn't just quietly pass some laws. No, they put on a show. They held these incredibly elaborate pageants in Delhi called durbars. And these weren't just big parties. They were highly orchestrated theatrical performances of imperial authority. The whole point was to demand visible submission. By making Indian princes assemble and publicly bow to the British crown, they were sending a very loud, very clear message to local elites, who they desperately needed to actually run things, and, of course, to the global press back home. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Notice the sharp, almost glaring contrast between the rhetoric and the reality here. Queen Victoria promises equal protection. She promises religious freedom. But on the ground, her colonial administrators honor those rights selectively, to put it mildly. The whole Empress of India title really reflected Britain viewing this as some grand civilizational project, which played great for conservative politics back in London for sure. But true equality, that was decidedly not the defining feature of the Raj. Section 3. The economics of empire, deindustrialization and famine. Okay, look at this data, because it is genuinely staggering. Before colonization, around 1750, India accounted for roughly 25% of all world manufacturing, a quarter of the globe's output. By 1900, that collapsed to just 2%. So how does that even happen? Well, it was a systematic, calculated deindustrialization. The British deliberately dismantled India's industry by flooding the market with dirt-cheap, machine-made cloth from Britain while slapping heavy taxes on Indian exports. They completely, fundamentally rewired India's economy strictly to feed British industrial needs. And unfortunately, that restructuring didn't just stop at manufacturing. It tore right through the agricultural sector, with absolutely horrifying results.
The Raj forced subsistence farmers into cash-based taxation systems. So instead of growing food to survive, they were forced to grow cash crops for export. When the monsoon rains inevitably failed, these farmers had absolutely no buffer. Zero. This directly led to the Great Famine of 1876 to 1879, where an estimated 5.5 million people died in southern India. And perhaps the most chilling part of all this? While millions were actively starving to death, the Raj continued to export grain out of the subcontinent.
Historian Mike Davis captures the horrifying scale of these preventable deaths perfectly with this phrase, late Victorian holocausts. He really drives home the point that these fatalities were not just bad weather or natural climatic shocks. They were the direct, measurable result of a colonial economic structure that violently stripped away the resilience of local people, all for the sake of imperial profit margins. Section 4. French Rule in Indochina. The Civilizing Mission and Resistance. Now we shift gears to the French, who essentially utilized this creeping, highly methodical three-step playbook for their colonization of modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It's actually incredibly similar to the British pattern. Step 1, get your foot in the door with commercial presence. Step 2, wait for or, maybe conveniently provoke a local conflict to justify bringing in the military. And step 3, once your troops are physically there, you consolidate that presence into permanent direct administrative control. You can trace this methodical expansion right here. It starts with the seizure of Saigon in 1859. Give it a few years and they impose a protectorate on Cambodia. Fast forward to 1887, they've grabbed central and northern Vietnam to officially complete the Union of Indochina, finally tossing Laos into the mix by 1893. Over just 3 short decades, military conquest systematically swallowed an entire region. But here is a major difference. Where the British were mostly obsessed with commerce and keeping the ledgers balanced, the French went all in on an ideological, civilizing mission. They actively engaged in cultural erasure. We're talking aggressively imposing the French language in schools, entirely abolishing the traditional Confucian exam systems, throwing massive state support behind Catholic missions, and enforcing brutal corvée labor, basically forced labor, to build their infrastructure. Because they were so aggressive with this cultural and physical domination, they faced continuous, heavy Vietnamese armed resistance for decades. Section 5. Direct versus indirect rule. The administrative choice. Because, as we know, conquering territory is one thing, but actually administering it on a Tuesday morning, that is a completely different challenge. European powers essentially had to pick between 2 strategies. Option A, indirect rule. This was cheaper, it minimized cultural friction by keeping local sultans or village headmen in place, and the Europeans basically just pulled the strings from behind the scenes. Option B, direct rule. This meant a complete overhaul, sweeping away local leaders and installing European bureaucrats and foreign law codes. Both options hit the same ultimate goal of extracting resources, but the costs and the cultural chaos were vastly different. And the British Raj is actually the perfect case study for this, because they pragmatically just did both. In the major, highly profitable economic hubs, like the presidencies of Bengal, Bombay, and Madras, they used direct rule to keep an incredibly tight grip. But out across the vast interior, across 562 distinct princely states, they used indirect rule. It was a very calculated, hybrid approach. The goal was simply to maximize extraction, while keeping the massive, sprawling costs of running a subcontinent somewhat under control. So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Whether it was the British draining wealth from Indian farmers or the French forcibly imposing their language on the Vietnamese, these empires required massively oppressive, intricate systems of control. But here is the paradox. In building the railways, the modern bureaucracies, and the deeply unequal societies required to run these imperial machines, did the architects of empire accidentally forge the very tools, the unified national identities, and the deep resentments that leaders like Ho Chi Minh and others would eventually use to tear the whole system down? It's a fascinating question to consider when we look at the long-term legacy of this era.